Hello, welcome to Musing Heavy yet again, the site devoted to alternative reflections on hard rock and heavy metal. My name is Stephen Meyer, and this is part 6 of a 7-part series entitled The Underrated Fallacy. And in this particular episode, we're going to concentrate on specific period Deep Purple. So let's just dig right in. All right, share my screen with the good folks out there. So part 6, and again, as always, check out the links below if you want to read the essay in its entirety. Why is so much great work from well-known artists overlooked, right? That's the central sort of theme in this section, all right? There are many veteran heavy bands that live with the fact that immense portions of their catalog will forever be ignored by the vast majority, right? Indeed, most hard rock or metal groups that have been around for at least a couple of decades are widely known for only an album or two, if they're lucky, actually. Some are just known for perhaps a handful of songs. Others are known for one smash, so-called one-hit wonders, right? Classic rock radio, endless repackaging of hits compilations, and frankly, unimaginative live set lists from the bands themselves can effectively erode, say, a 15-plus album career into just a dozen tunes or less, right? And not necessarily the best dozen songs, just the most popular ones, right? The other songs are rendered insignificant and only have meaning to the band's hardcore following, which may or may not be a lot of folks, right? Hard rock institution Deep Purple is an excellent case in point for this, and that's what we're going to talk about here for the most part in this section. All right, so as I always try to do, put my biases right on the table here. I would humbly consider myself a rather enthusiastic patron of the Deep Purple Appreciation Society. I mean, I hate to do this, but I'll do it anyway. Deep Purple, if they're not my favorite group, they're definitely in my top 3, right, all time. So, up there with Black Sabbath and Rush, I would say. So anyway, I'm a Purple fanatic, right? I personally believe, again, getting my biases out of the way, that each of the 7 distinct recording lineups, so there's been 7 accepted, I guess, eras of Deep Purple or marks of Deep Purple. I think all 7 of these lineups have immense importance. All 23 of their official studio albums, not counting the compilations, are essential. And I have yet to hear an authorized live album that's anything less than stellar. I actually did a quick count, before I sort of put this section together, just out of curiosity as much as anything. I actually surprised myself a bit. I got 21 live Deep Purple CDs, right? And I'll be honest with you, I'm always still looking for more, right? They're awesome in the studio, and they're even more awesome live, I believe. So, they're just that kind of band for me. I am convinced that people like me, though, are actually quite rare, in spite of Deep Purple's massive legacy, right? Okay. There are a substantial amount of self-proclaimed devotees, so people who call themselves Deep Purple fans, and I'm sure they are. I'm not questioning that they aren't, right? But people who call themselves, Deep Purple fans, who I would say somewhat paradoxically stubbornly disregard some or most of Purple's configurations, right? All you got to do is spend a little time on various online media to catch a glimpse of ongoing debates over which eras of Deep Purple are valid, right? So again, it's the band does generate some controversy because of all their different lineups, and even many self-proclaimed Purple fans aren't on board for all of them, right? So like I say, people like me are actually kind of rare comparatively. Then, probably predictably, there are numerous other fans of Deep Purple who are a lot more casual, right? And who have interest in only, say, a few albums or perhaps just a cluster of songs. Fair enough, right? I mean, every band has their more casual type fan, and that's fine. And then even at its most distilled, I think it's fair to assume that the vast majority of the music enjoying populace, whether they even recognize the name Deep Purple or not, know one tune for sure, Dan, dan, dan. They know smoke on the water, right? Okay, so you might think that given where I stand with Deep Purple, that I'd be on the front line screaming for justice in my Ian Gillan's voice, right? Well, I wish I had Ian Gillan's voice. So you'd think I'd be the guy screaming for justice, right? When certain albums or lineups are ignored by not only the general public, which we might expect, but even by many of my purple brothers and sisters, right? And as much as I might want to, though, I can't defend this position. There's no reason for me to scream about it, right? Okay, so to avoid a lot of repetition, I will not go into great detail on each of Deep Purple's albums, lineups, or characteristics. Please see numerous other sources available online. Actually, Wikipedia has a decent Deep Purple page, so you could probably go there if you wanted a little more information, but there's lots of other sources also. But I am going to do a fast little overview of the eras just to put a little context in here for people that aren't that familiar with Deep Purple. And you'll see, again, I won't get into the complexities, but I think you'll get an idea of how complex sort of the eras of Deep Purple can get. Okay, so let's do that real quick, just to sort of bring everybody sort of at the same level here. So I've organized Deep Purple's albums, and I'm only going to do the studio albums. If you start bringing in the live albums, this kind of gets ridiculous. But so there's been 7 accepted eras of Deep Purple, lineups of Deep Purple, often referred to as marks. Okay, so Mark 1. So Deep Purple starts in 1968, and Mark 1 goes for a couple of years. We've got Ritchie Blackmore on guitar, John Lord on keyboards, Ian Pace on drums, the only guy, by the way, who's made it right to the present as a member of Deep Purple, Rod Evans on vocals, and Nick Simper on bass guitar. They released 3 albums over that 2-year span, maybe 2.5 years. Shades of Deep Purple being the first album, The Book of Taliesin, and a self-titled album called Deep Purple, the third one. Then we get to Mark II Deep Purple. Now, the thing about Mark II is it actually has 3 different phases, right? There's the initial run of Mark II, then they reformed, and then they reformed again, right? So this lineup keeps popping up through time, and each time they released albums, but each time they stayed together less and less time as well. But anyway, their initial phase, which incidentally is by far Deep Purple's most popular phase, more about that in a second, but we'll just get the eras out of the way here. So this goes from Mark II's initial phase, goes from 1969 to 1973. It includes, so Ritchie Blackmore, John Lord, and Ian Pace remain from Mark I, but we add Ian Gillan on vocals and Roger Glover on bass guitar to replace Rod Evans and Nick Simper, right? They start with a bit of an anomaly in the catalog. It's actually Deep Purple recording with the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra, a bit of an anomaly. But then we get into the bona fide hard rock stuff with Deep Purple in Rock, Fireball, Machine Head, by far their best known album. And who do we think we are, right? Then we move on through time. We get to Mark III, right? And this lasts from 1974 to roughly 1975. Ritchie Blackmore, John Lord, and Ian Pace remain original members, but Ian Gillan and Roger Glover are replaced by David Coverdale, who went on to Whitesnake fame, for instance, and Glenn Hughes, who went on to all kinds of different things. Glenn Hughes also as vocalist, so actually for this era, Deep Purple has 2 vocalists, which actually made for really unique sound. Anyway, this lineup releases 2 albums, Burn and Stormbringer. And then we move on later in 1975, Ritchie Blackmore is replaced by Tommy Bolin on guitar. Otherwise, everybody stays from Mark III, so Lord, Pace, Coverdale, and Hughes, right? After Mark IV folds, right, Deep Purple, the name Deep Purple actually goes on hiatus for a few years. Tommy Bolin sadly dies of a drug overdose, but I don't think they were going to continue anyway. But they do reform in 1984, right? So it took a few years, but the Deep Purple name is back in action, so to speak. And it's Mark II that's reforming, right? So we're back to here. So this lineup reforms in 1984. So Ritchie Blackmore comes back, and you got John Lord, Ian Pace, Gillan and Glover are back as well, right? This lineup releases 2 albums, Perfect Strangers and House of the Blue Light, right? Doesn't last, unfortunately. So Mark II fractures yet again. Well, essentially what happens is Ian Gillan gets kicked out of the band. Ian Gillan and Richie Blackmore in particular always had trouble coexisting in the band. And so Ian Gillan's gone, and Mark II morphs into actually Mark V as they add Joe Lynn Turner on vocals instead of Ian Gillan, but the other four members remain. That only lasts for 1 year as well, or about a year and a half with the tour, and Mark II reforms yet again. Ian Gillan comes back, and we have Mark II reform with Blackmore, Lord, Pace, Gillan, and Glover for The Battle Rages On. But so this is the third time Mark II has recorded, but each time it lasts less and less time. This didn't make it much past a year. And this time, though, Ian Gillan stays in the band and has been there up until the present time. It's Richie Blackmore who's gone, and this time, seemingly for good, he's never come back since. And so we're on to Mark VI, right? And it goes from 1996 to 1998. And essentially, with Richie Blackmore gone, it's Steve Morse replaces Richie on guitar. And then you continue on with Lord, Pace, Gillan, and Glover. So essentially, it's Mark II, less Blackmore, add Steve Morse, okay? And they record Perpendicular and Abandoned, right? And then we got, so that's Mark VI. And then we're into our present version of Deep Purple, which now we're at Mark VII. And the change here is with John Lord. John Lord leaves Deep Purple, this time on good terms, actually. John Lord always was sort of the peacemaker. But John Lord retires from Deep Purple, gets into true classical music, and sadly dies soon after that. But anyway, John Lord is replaced by the very capable Don Airey, right? And this is our present version of Deep Purple. So Steve Morse on guitar, Don Airey on keyboards, Ian Pace, as I say, the only original member who made it through all phases, and then longtime serving, the drummer Ian Pace, and then longtime serving vocalist Ian Gillan and Roger Glover on bass guitar. And they've released quite a few albums, right? Bananas, Rapture of the Deep, Now What, Infinite, Whoosh, and their latest one, Turning to Crime, which is actually a covers album, the only time Deep Purple's ever done that. All right, so there's a fast little overview. Again, pretty complicated history, right? Pretty interesting one too. So again, it's worth digging into if you're a Purple fan or even just a casual Purple fan. It's worth digging into. There's always, every time I go online and look for stuff, I always learn a few new things, whatever. Anyway, so there's lots of sites out there to give you more detail. All right, let's bring this back into sort of my overall thesis here of why material from really well-known bands, certain parts of it are a lot less popular than other parts, and can we call those parts underrated that aren't known as well? Okay, so let's dig into that a little bit. So with Deep Purple, for a lot of people, it seems it's always about Mark II, right? Marsha, 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 if you're Jan Brady, like that sort of thing, right? I don't know, dumb analogy. But anyway, it's always about Mark II. The so-called Mark II configuration that contains, as I've said, so it contains Blackmore on guitar, John Lord on keyboards, Gillan vocals, Glover bass, and Ian Pace on drums, is unquestionably the most widely known version of Deep Purple, right? And as I said, this lineup had 3 different incarnations. It's the initial run in the 70s that really has overshadowed everything the band has ever done, right? They were so successful in those run of 1970s albums that it really, for a lot of people, it almost eclipses everything else the band has done. There's a couple other eras, though, that at least have a certain level of popularity that should be noted. Mark I has its fans. The original version of Deep Purple with Rod Evans and Nick Simper. Mark III actually has a substantial amount of fans as well, which includes David Coverdale and Glenn Hughes. And even the Tommy Bolin Mark IV era has its admirers for sure. And each of these, so say Mark I, III, and IV, certainly have their admirers, right? No question. Yet none of these rival the colossal importance of Mark II, built on the pillars of particularly the albums In Rock, Fireball, Machine Head, Made in Japan, live album. Like I said, I didn't include live albums here because it just gets crazy. Perhaps who do we think we are, right? But having said all that, we can even boil this down more, right? While it's no question, Mark II, the 1970s versions of Mark II has eclipsed so much of what Deep Purple has done for a lot of people. But really, even just Machine Head, has had a disproportionate amount of interest compared to everything else in the catalog. That one album, Machine Head alone and its cluster of mammoth classics, probably you'll know them: Highway Star, Lazy, Space Trucking, and most profoundly, Smoke on the Water, was really all that was needed to ensure that Deep Purple was essentially immortal in the annals of music, right? Notwithstanding, so what about other stuff? Well, notwithstanding some initial spark of intrigue when Mark II reformed in 1984, I remember what had happened. It did create a lot of interest, right? And notably the first album when they reformed, Perfect Strangers. But having said all that, pretty much everything Deep Purple did after the 1970s was of concern to only a subset of their fan base, right? So as I mentioned, Mark II is the big one, especially the 1970s Mark II. Mark I, Mark III, and Mark IV, reasonable amount of interest, right? Nothing close to Mark II, but reasonable amount of interest. But then when we get into Mark V and on, now we're talking little interest. So the short-lived Mark V version of Deep Purple with Joe Lynn Turner on vocals, and especially the most recent configurations that feature Steve Morse on guitar, and then replacing Ritchie Blackmore, and then a little bit later when Don Airey replaces John Lord, so that brings us to Mark VI and VII respectively. These lineups have become dangerously close to attaining little more than cult standing, right? In fact, I would argue that if it were not for the use of the mythical Deep Purple moniker, the current lineup of Deep Purple would be hard-pressed to rise above club or bar status in most parts of the world, right? And that's in spite of recording what I would consider 7 absolutely stellar studio albums, produced by high-profile guy Bob Ezrin, by the way, and continuing to be a great live act. So in spite of the fact that Deep Purple puts out what I think is still great, amazing music, and they're still great live, they haven't lost their chops one bit, right? The last 3 eras of Deep Purple are basically not that popular at all. And if they wouldn't be calling themselves Deep Purple, they probably would be basically a bar band. I mean, I might be over, at least in some parts of the world, let's put it that way, right? Okay, so are any of Mark VII's, right, the latest version of Deep Purple, is any of these works underrated, right? Namely, Bananas, Rapture of the Deep, Now What, Infinite, Whoosh, or even Turning to Crime, or any of their live albums from this period. Is any of that underrated? Not really. Not really. And why? Because this has a lot to do with an inherent lack of widespread demand for this product. Okay, so we're going to dig into that a little more, because that sort of is, you could say that's sort of the heart of this entire series when I'm sort of getting at this rating of heavy music. Right. Okay, so for those of us who do truly respect and enjoy the current version of Deep Purple, and I'm one of them, our reflexive urge to defend has to be curbed. And we should ask, who are these albums actually for? Right? I mean, I'm talking about the most recent versions of Deep Purple. Who are these albums actually for? If we link this back to the 5 classes of music fans that I developed earlier in the paper, right? The truth is, the labors of Mark VII were destined to appeal to only a small segment of Deep Purple fans, and indeed a minuscule proportion of the music-consuming public in general. Quick refresher, I won't spend a lot of time on this. If you want to check this out in more detail, I do explain it more in part 2, but just a real fast overview again. So these 5 classes I'm talking about of music fans, here they are. So it's based on who is likely to value heavy music. Well, the class 1 fan doesn't value heavy music. They're not fans of heavy metal and hard rock. They might know the odd heavy song kind of by accident, right? But they're not into heavy music at all. So that's a big part of the world, really. Let's face it, the majority of people. Then there's the class 2 type fan, and they do like some heavy music, but they only like the hits. They only like the classics. They're not interested in album cuts or digging deep into a band. Just give me the hits kind of thing, right? This is a huge amount of people as well. So class 1 and class 2 fans make up the vast majority of the music public, right? Class 3 is also a big category in this context as well. These are serious music fans, but they're not necessarily hard rock or heavy metal fans, right? They like jazz, or they like classical, or they like country and western, or they like pop or whatever, right? But they might have the odd heavy metal or hard rock album in their collection, if there's some crossover sort of with what they normally listen to, right? So with Deep Purple, for instance, maybe they have the concerto, right? Or one or two of their albums that are sort of more classically influenced, if they happen to be a fan of classical music, for example, or something like that, right? But they're not big fans of hard rock and metal. They're just maybe the odd crossover thing that they enjoy, right? So really, a very small segment of the world, comparatively, is a fan of hard rock and heavy metal, and they're class 4 and 5 fans that I've got here. Now, the class 4 fan, though, is a niche-oriented heavy fan. So they don't like all types of heavy music. They only like specific types. So maybe they just like black metal, or they just like thrash metal, or they just like a specific era of heavy music. They only listen to early 70s heavy rock, right? So they're that type of fan. Or you got the heavy fan that is more encompassing. They like all types of heavy music and all eras, and they try to keep current with as much as they can, although it's impossible. They try to do the best they can. So there's just so much out there. Okay, so that's what I was talking about by the 5 classes of fans, right? So if we bring this back to the Deep Purple thing, right? So as I was saying, if we link this back to those 5 classes, right? The most recent version of Deep Purple are only going to appeal to a really small segment of the population, a small segment of actually Deep Purple fans, right? And then certainly a wee small amount of the general public in general, right? So great swaths of class 1 and class 2 people are only concerned with the hits, right? Like we defined, especially hits of yesteryear. They don't really care that much about what's happening today. It's mostly about classic rock radio kind of thing. Okay, that's a lot of people that are in that boat, right? It follows then that most media will tirelessly cater to these demands. It makes sense. If that's what most people are into, well, that's what most media sources are going to give them, right? So in this environment, when it comes to Deep Purple, then what are they going to play on? Well, they're going to play evergreen songs from Machine Head. So they're going to constantly play Smoke on the Water and Highway Star and Lazy and Space Truckin'. That totally makes sense, right? Or from other eras of Deep Purple, they're going to play Hush from Mark 1. That was the one big hit that the first, it's a cover, but that the first version, the original version of Deep Purple had. Maybe Kentucky Woman, that was another cover, but it was a semi-hit from Mark 1 as well, right? They might play a couple other, I don't know if they're big hits necessarily, but they're certainly classic songs from Mark 2, right? Again, for the classic rock radio audience, you might say. So they'll play Strange Kind of Woman once in a while, right, from the Fireball sessions. Or they might play Black Knight, right? You hear that one quite a bit too, from the In Rock sessions. Woman from Tokyo gets played too. The only song they'll play from Who Do We Think We Are, right? Or sometimes, rarely I would say, but if the classic rock programmer is especially adventurous, and we need more of these folks, but we don't seem to have them that much, they might play the epics, things like Child in Time, from In Rock. Maybe they'll play Burn from Mark III, probably the classic song, I guess, from the Mark III Deep Purple. They might play Perfect Strangers, right? That's like the only song that they're going to play, say that, that's not in the 70s, right? Maybe you'll get those songs rolled out, but I wouldn't hold my breath, right? So the reality of the situation is that the vast number of folks tuning into classic rock radio or listening to various satellite feeds, which a lot of people do, or people that are downloading all kinds of songs, or they're streaming songs, right? Or they're searching on YouTube, right? The vast majority of people are not Deep Purple supporters. They're essentially fans of Machine Head. Or perhaps they're just fans of Smoke on the Water, right? So we have to keep that in mind, right? These folks, the vast majority of the world, they might tolerate an occasional deeper album cut, especially from the glory years of Mark II, or possibly Mark III occasionally, but definitely anything after the Perfect Strangers album would be unthinkable. So anything after 1984, forget it, right? There's no chance they're going to want to listen to that. So without hits or classics, it's predictable then these most recent versions of Deep Purple are going to be invisible to the mainstream. So versions Mark 5, 6, and 7 Deep Purple, it makes total sense that the mainstream has no time for them, right? There's no hits, there's no classics, there's nothing that classic rock radio is just going to spin forever. So these versions of Deep Purple are invisible to them, right? That to me, again, we might not like it, but it makes total sense, right? Because that's what the music fan is looking for. They just want the hits, especially the hits of yesteryear. Well, they're not going to care about the recent versions of Deep Purple because it doesn't fit in with what they listen to. And programmers, then they know that, and they're not going to play it, right? Okay, but what about people that are beyond just the class 1 and class 2 fan, and they actually like Deep Purple? Well, that doesn't necessarily guarantee that they're going to play anything from the recent versions, right? Although not as restrictive, certain types of biases actually permeate many Deep Purple fans as well. There are a substantial number of class 4 heavy fans on that typology we looked at, who concentrate intensely on certain eras of hard rock, and who might even cite Deep Purple as a favorite. They call themselves a Deep Purple fan, right? So again, I'm not saying they're not. If you say you are, no problem, right? But these are folks who aren't going to care about anything that Ritchie Blackmore didn't play on. It's like, if Ritchie's not on it, it's like, nah, I don't want to hear it, right? Lots of Deep Purple fans out there like that, right? No Blackmore, no Purple. So they've just eliminated anything recent, like since what, 1990, right? So a long time, right? To these folks, it does not matter how much the truly gifted Steve Morse or Don Airey have added to the Purple sound, or how incredibly great Ian Gillan, Roger Glover, and Ian Pace continue to be, right? Doesn't matter. They simply don't care. As a result, any recent release by Deep Purple is just for that rare, all-encompassing supporter who appreciates the entire Purple catalog, i.e. me, and I don't think there's that many people out there like me. I'm not a big market. Or for the few heavy music devotees open enough to explore a new album by any heavy band. Again, a small subset, say, of class 5 in the typology, right? Okay. Well, let's face it, let's be honest here. That makes for a really small market of potential buyers. And if set lists are any indication, Deep Purple seems to get this. It's not like this blindsides Deep Purple. I think they totally understand that, right? Because if you go to see Deep Purple live, or you check out their live albums, which I got lots of them, or I do this too. I'll just go online, and even if I'm not going to a concert, I'll see what songs they're playing, on a given tour, right? If you check that out, Deep Purple never strays from playing the hits, right? And Machine Head is always heavily represented, right? So they get this, right? Yeah, okay, they rotate their songs a little bit from tour to tour. I'm not saying they play the same thing year after year, but inevitably, the song interchanges come almost exclusively from their high-profile 1970s albums, right? A typical concert, so we're talking about, again, Mark II 1970s, right? We're talking 4 albums. So if you go to a Deep Purple show or check out their live albums, like 75% of it's coming just from that cluster of albums, stuff they did 50 years ago, right? All right, so a typical concert, a Deep Purple show, will also include material from the current album. So they'll try to promote what they're working on right now, maybe as many as 3 songs, often just a couple, right? But everything else, except for the tune Perfect Strangers, which they seem to keep all the time, everything else just disappears, right? So you might ask, right? If the band, in this case Deep Purple, never revisits the vast majority of their catalog when they're playing live, have they yielded to market forces? And are they really doing a give the people what they want sort of thing, right? Yeah, in a word, that's exactly what Deep Purple's doing. They get it, right? They know most people don't care about their catalog. So when you go see them live, they're rolling out Machine Head and a few other classics from the 70s, couple new songs, add in Perfect Strangers, there's your show, right? Okay, so because of that, right, can an album or an era be underrated if there really is no unmet demand for it? That's the key, right? Not logically, right? Not logically, okay? So you can't say the latest version of Deep Purple's underrated because there's really no unmet demand for it. It's for a very small market of basically people like me, right? That's it. Okay. So that might beg the following question. Then you might think, so why does Deep Purple continue to create any new music if there seems to be no demand, or at least if there is demand, it's really small, right? Okay, why do they do that? And there's a lot of longtime bands that actually, like Kiss, Paul Stanley and Gene Simmons have said for quite a while, there's no point in us putting out new albums. You know, nobody wants to hear it. When we play live, they just want to hear all the old songs. They just want to hear stuff from the 70s, basically. So what's the point in putting out new music? So why does Deep Purple do it? And there's others that do, right? So why do they do it? Well, again, as far as Deep Purple's concerned, each member is famous, right? Not only in the realm of heavy music, but in several prog and jazz rock fusion circles as well. The members in Deep Purple are highly respected. There's no question about it. They are truly musicians, right? And the Deep Purple legacy is more than secured, right? So really, simply, what else has Deep Purple got to prove, right? There's no reason for them to put out anything new, right? They're already recognized as, you know, some of the most important musicians ever in heavy music. Like, that's indisputable, right? And I don't think they need the money. I mean, given previous commercial triumphs, it would be hard to imagine that Gillan, Pace, Glover, Morris, or Airy really do this because they need more money. I'm sure they're very wealthy men, and deservedly so, right? So why do they put out new music? Well, I'm convinced that new music is produced primarily to satisfy the creative urges of the band members themselves. And if only a comparatively small number of their fans get it, so be it, right? Again, as a fanatic when it comes to all things Purple, I've read a ton of stuff about these guys, and I'll continue to buy new books as they come out, et cetera, because I can't get enough Deep Purple. I really can't. So as a fanatic, I have read enough about these individuals to come to a firm conclusion that each is truly the real deal, right? They are true artists in every sense of the word, right? There's very few artists I can think of that I respect more than the current versions of Deep Purple. I really have that much respect for them. And I think any longtime fan or all-encompassing Deep Purple fan, people like myself, right? We should just consider ourselves lucky that Mark 7 members are dedicated to following their muse and not be concerned why others are not on board. So people like me, we need to stop worrying about, well, why aren't more people listening to Bananas and Whoosh and et cetera? These are killer albums. You're missing out. Yeah, I do think you're missing out. But really, I should just be worrying about the fact that I'm really lucky that I get to keep hearing these guys put out great music, because there's no reason they have to, and they're doing it purely because they're true artists. That's why they're doing it, right? So we shouldn't worry about why more fans aren't on board, because considering the taste of most music people, there's really no reason they should be, right? They're not underrated. This era is not underappreciated. Things are pretty much like they should be. Okay, so just to wrap this section, I'm going to broaden it a little bit. And Deep Purple's not alone, because there's lots of great music that stays under the radar. Let's face it, right? So given the comparative ease in which people can produce their own professional music and make it widely available, especially compared to the past, right? Where you had to have expensive recording studios, you needed management teams, and nothing much happened without record company backing. Well, a lot of that's changed today, right? But because there's so much stuff out there, it's inevitable that many fine songs and albums just sort of get lost in the shuffle. They get lost in the unfathomable sea of downloading and streaming, right? But it might be, so obscure bands, I'm sure we get that, right? But it might be surprising to some that so much fine work from even big name artists meet a similar fate and become effectively obscured. More times than not, I've come to discover, although I'm sure other people have figured this out as well, but more times than not, there's a linear relationship with veteran heavy acts. The newer the material, the greater the indifference, right? So the further we get away typically from the 70s, the less that people seem to be interested in the music, other than a few of the hardcore folks, right? Well, the Deep Purple situation demonstrated this perfectly, but they're not alone. I'd say the same thing is true again, that there's this linear relationship that the newer the material, the more the indifference, right? It's occurring with Uriah Heep. It's occurring with UFO, with Ted Nugent, with Heaven and Hell, which was essentially the last versions of Black Sabbath, with Nazareth, with Alice Cooper, with Blue Oyster Cult, with ZZ Top, with Motorhead, with Saxon, with Accept, and on it goes, right? In my view, all of these artists that I just quickly named have created amazing albums in their twilight years, right? An opinion consistently shared by others, by the way, who actually care about these eras, right? Yet most people, if they're into heavy music at all, just keep listening to what these artists did decades ago, over and over and over, right? Why? Why is it that way? Okay, let's just explore that just to sort of summarize, just to end this section. I think I'm going to provide three what I think are interrelated answers for this. So why is there this linear relationship? Where a lot of longtime successful bands, right? The newer the material, though, the less popular it seems to get. Why is this occurring? Okay, I think there's three reasons, or three possible reasons for this. Okay, first one. Some fans, maybe lots of fans actually, are turned off when groups lack original members, right? Or others don't like it or lose interest in certain lineups, right? I mean, it's amazing to me. I tend not to be this type of person, but it's amazing to me how so many fans just have they cling to original members in bands. And as soon as a couple members are gone, it's like, oh, I don't care anymore, right? I mean, with Deep Purple, there's so many people that will say, no Blackmore, no Deep Purple. So therefore, they care about nothing that the last, 2-3 decades that the band has done. It's gone. If Richie's not there, I just don't care, right? Well, there's a lot, and I'm not saying you're wrong for that. I mean, if that's how you are, that's how you are, and it's all good, right? But I think that explains some of this, right? So if a recent album by a longtime heavy band contains, say, just one founding member or just two members, right? It may be a very hard sell, regardless of how good the music might be, right? If you're interested in this topic, I kind of did a whole paper on it. Please see my essay entitled "When to Retain the Group Name: Defining and Applying the Led Zeppelin and Deep Purple Paradigm." So what I do is I sort of come up with a little framework as to when I think, well, it's not just what I think, I hope it's objective, but when it seems appropriate that a band carries on with their name, even if they've lost some key members. I think there's time where it made sense that a band carried on with their name, even though they lost, a couple members, right? And then I think there's other circumstances where it no longer makes any sense, right? That the band has changed too much to justify why they should keep the name, right? So if you're into that, check that paper out. I really dig into that issue in a lot more, with a lot more vigor than I will right now. Okay, second reason for this linear relationship is to, the newer material gets met with more indifference. Okay, while I recognize the quality of more recent output from many veteran heavy bands, there's no doubt that the reverberations generated by albums that built initial reputations can never be replicated, right? Again, another theme that I developed more properly in another paper, this paper is called "Is Conflict Needed for Great Heavy Music? Consider Aerosmith, UFO, and Yngwie Malmsteen," right? In this paper, I argue that every artist has what I call a limited, extraordinarily innovative period. Rolls right off the tongue, I guess, right? Well, not really. But anyway, I couldn't come up with a better catchphrase, but that really captures what I'm saying. A limited, extraordinarily innovative period. This is a time when the band is at the height of its creative powers, and it's able to captivate both the hardcore fan and even the wider audiences with career and genre-defining works of art. So this is when Machine Head was created for Deep Purple, for instance. It's a fleeting time, right? Usually it's a span of 5 years or less, okay? Therefore, no matter how great the new music might be, it can never live up to the magical importance of when the group was at its most innovative, which for most lawn-serving heavy bands tended to occur in the 1970s. So it wasn't just Deep Purple, not just Machine Head, I guess, but say In Rock Fireball to Machine Head, right? Was their limited, extraordinarily creative period. But I list it for all kinds of other bands, right? I think that has a lot to do with it as well. So as to why we're seeing this phenomena, right, why the newer material gets increasingly ignored by people. because it's outside of the limited, extraordinarily innovative period, right? So therefore, it's no coincidence then that this is the period that classic rock programmers perpetually emphasize, right? And most music fans are going to favor, right? And then finally, in spite of positive reviews, contemporary albums by old timers, again, such as Deep Purple, UFO, Uriah Heep, Alice and Ted, etc. These, again, the new material from these bands, they have no hits. I mean, the material might be great, but there's no hits. There's no classics, right? And there's nothing that remains in set lists beyond specific tours, right? Yet, as argued previously in this paper, any tag of underrated is actually misplaced, right? Small pools of longtime fans will naturally be on board with the new music and are going to judge the material accordingly. But because there's no hits and no classics, right? Again, linking it back to that typology of 5 classes of music fans we were talking about, it's logical then, though, that everyone else will be either enjoying the old hits exclusively, right? Or listening to a few key albums of yesteryear over and over and over and over. And if that's your thing, cool. Not my thing, but whatever. If that, lots of people, that's what they do. Or, of course, immersed in other forms of music far removed from bands like Deep Purple. So this all makes sense. There's not unmet demand here for the most current versions of Deep Purple, or indeed UFO, Uriah Heep, Alice, etc. Things are basically as they should be, right? Okay, so that's part 6. Part 7 wraps things up, right? And what I'm going to do, in addition to wrapping up this series, you might have noticed that throughout this series, I'm going to great lengths to try to demonstrate that most heavy bands and or certain eras of heavy bands are not truly underrated. So you might think, well, is anything underrated? Yep. I do think there are circumstances where heavy bands or artists in general are indeed underrated. So check out part 7 to find out what that's all about. Thanks for listening, as always. I really appreciate it. I will see you hopefully in part 7. Take care.